The gunshot echoed across the Montana prairie, sending a flock of startled birds into the dusky October sky of 1876. Josephine Kane hadn't expected to find herself crawling through tall grass, blood seeping from her wounded leg as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountains. The stagecoach robbery was supposed to be a simple affair until she'd witnessed the murder, and the bandits had spotted her watching from the ridge. Pain seared through her thigh as she dragged herself toward a cluster of cottonwoods beside a shallow creek. The wound wasn't mortal, but the bullet had torn through enough muscle to render her leg useless. Night was falling fast, and with it came the cold Montana air that could kill as surely as any gunshot. Josephine bit her lip to keep from crying out as she pulled herself over a fallen log. 23 years of life hadn't prepared her for this alone, injured and miles from the nearest town. After her father's death last month, she'd been traveling to her aunt's home in Helena. Now she wondered if she'd live to see morning. The snap of a twig froze her in place. Someone was approaching. "Don't move," a deep voice commanded. Josephine twisted around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer tucked in her boot, the one possession her father had insisted she carry. But her fingers trembled too much to grip it properly. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, leading a chestnut mare. The last light of day revealed a man dressed in range clothes, worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a dust-covered Stetson. His face was partially obscured by several days' growth of beard, but his eyes were alert, studying her with a mixture of caution and concern. "You're bleeding," he stated flatly. "How observant of you," Josephine retorted, her fear manifesting as sarcasm. A hint of a smile touched the man's lips. "Name's Hayes Irwin. I'm tracking the men who hit that stagecoach. I reckon you're what they were shooting at back there." Josephine nodded, suddenly exhausted. "They killed the driver. I saw everything from the ridge." "I was gathering flowers when," she stopped, realizing how frivolous that sounded now. "They saw me watching." Hayes knelt beside her, keeping a respectful distance while examining her wound. "Bullet went clean through. That's good. Bad news is we're a day's ride from town and night's coming on." "I can't walk," Josephine admitted, hating the vulnerability in her voice. Hayes stood and adjusted his hat. "Then ride till you can run again." With surprising gentleness, he lifted her onto his horse. Josephine bit back a cry of pain as her injured leg settled against the animal's flank. "I have a camp set up in a canyon about 2 miles from here," he explained, gathering the reins and leading the horse. "We'll get that leg tended to, then figure out our next move." "The men who did this," Josephine said, clutching the saddle horn to steady herself. "There were 3 of them." "They took the strongbox from the coach," Hayes nodded. "The Blackburn gang, been hitting stages all across the territory. I've been on their trail for 3 weeks. You're a lawman, used to be." Something dark flashed across his face. "Now I'm just a man with a purpose." Josephine studied him as they moved through the gathering darkness. His shoulders were broad beneath his worn shirt, his movements confident despite the rough terrain. There was something reassuring about his presence, though she'd been taught to be wary of strangers, especially in these untamed lands. "I'm Josephine Kane," she offered. "My father died last month. I was heading to Helena to live with my aunt." Hayes glanced back at her. "Sorry about your father, Miss Kane." "Joe," she corrected. "Everyone calls me Joe." By the time they reached his camp, Josephine was nearly delirious with pain and exhaustion. Hayes helped her down from the horse and settled her near a small fire that was burning low in a sheltered hollow. "This might hurt," he warned as he cut away the blood-soaked fabric around her wound. His hands were calloused but moved with surprising precision. Josephine gripped the blanket beneath her as he cleaned the injury with whiskey. "Where did you learn to do this?" she asked through gritted teeth. "War," he answered simply. 4 years gives a man plenty of practice patching bullet holes." After bandaging her leg, Hayes brewed coffee and offered her jerky and hardtack from his provisions. The food was simple but revived her spirits somewhat. "Those men," she said as she sipped the bitter coffee, They killed that driver without hesitation, just shot him down when he refused to stop the coach. Hayes nodded grimly. That's their way. Led by a man named Luther Blackburn. He and his brothers have left a trail of bodies from Colorado to Montana. Why are you tracking them if you're not a lawman anymore? Hayes stared into the fire, and for a moment Josephine thought he wouldn't answer. They killed my brother, he said finally. He was a bank clerk in Cheyenne. They shot him during a robbery last spring. I'm sorry, Josephine whispered. Get some rest, Hayes replied, avoiding her gaze. We've got a long ride tomorrow. Despite her pain and the strangeness of her situation, Josephine fell into a deep sleep, lulled by exhaustion and the quiet sounds of the wilderness around them. She awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. The morning light filtered through the trees, revealing their campsite nestled between rock formations that provided natural shelter. Hayes was already awake, tending the small fire. How's the leg? He asked, handing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. Josephine shifted, testing the injured limb. Hurts like the devil, but I think the bleeding stopped. Good, we need to move. Those men might circle back if they think you can identify them. After a simple breakfast, Hayes helped Josephine onto his horse. Her leg throbbed with pain, but the wound looked clean when he'd changed the bandage. Where are we heading? She asked as he mounted behind her, his arms reaching around to hold the reins. There's a settlement about 20 miles southeast. Man named Abernathy runs a trading post there. He can get word to the marshal in Helena about what happened. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horse's gait settling into a soothing pattern. Josephine was acutely aware of Hayes's presence behind her, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the way his breath occasionally stirred her hair. Tell me about your father, Hayes said unexpectedly, as they crossed a wide meadow dotted with late-blooming wildflowers. Josephine smiled despite herself. He was a teacher, taught me everything from Shakespeare to shooting. After my mother died, it was just the two of us. He took a position at a school in Virginia City, but his heart gave out before the term began. Sounds like a good man. He was. Too good for this world, probably. She hesitated. What about your family? Not much to tell. My father ran off when I was young. Mother died during the war, just had my brother Thomas. He was the smart one, good with numbers, always had his nose in a book. Around midday, they stopped by a creek to rest the horse and eat. Hayes helped Josephine down and propped her against a sun-warmed boulder. You ride well for a schoolteacher's daughter, he observed, passing her a strip of jerky. I grew up in Colorado before Virginia City. Father believed girls should know how to ride and shoot same as boys, she smiled. He'd say being a lady doesn't mean being helpless. Hayes nodded appreciatively. Wise man. As he knelt to check her bandage, their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them, a moment of connection that startled them both. Hayes cleared his throat and stood. Bandages holding. We should reach Abernathy's by nightfall. They continued their journey, with Hayes pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his time as a deputy in Wyoming. Josephine found herself drawn to his quiet strength and occasional flashes of dry humor. Despite their circumstances, she felt safe with him in a way she hadn't expected. The sun was low on the horizon when Hayes suddenly tensed behind her. What is it? Josephine whispered. Smoke, he replied, nodding toward a thin dark column rising above the trees ahead. That's about where Abernathy's trading post should be. Hayes urged the horse forward with greater urgency. When they reached a ridge overlooking the small settlement, Josephine gasped. The trading post was ablaze, orange flames licking the darkening sky. Stay here, Hayes ordered, helping her down behind a large rock. He handed her his rifle. If anyone other than me approaches, shoot first and ask questions later. Before she could protest, he was gone, moving silently through the trees toward the burning building. Josephine watched anxiously, the rifle heavy in her hands. Minutes stretched like hours until finally Hayes reappeared, leading an older man with a bloodied arm. Blackburn Gang. the man, presumably Abernathy, was saying as they approached. They came asking about a woman who'd witnessed their stagecoach robbery. When I said I hadn't seen anyone, they didn't believe me. Hayes helped the traitor sit beside Josephine. This is Miss Kane. She's the one they're looking for. Abernathy nodded grimly. They're headed for the Elkhorn Mountains. Said something about meeting up with the rest of their outfit at Widow's Creek. Hayes's expression hardened. How many? Just the 3 that hit the stage, far as I could tell, but they mentioned others waiting. After tending to Abernathy's wound, a shallow cut to his upper arm, they made camp a safe distance from the still smoldering trading post. They're hunting me, Josephine said quietly as they sat around the small fire. You should leave me with Mr. Abernathy and continue your pursuit. I'm only slowing you down, Hayes shook his head. They know your face now, they'll keep looking. The safest place for you is with me. He's right, miss, Abernathy agreed. I'm heading to my sister's place in Bozeman tomorrow. You'd be better off with Hayes here. He's got quite the reputation from his martial days. Josephine looked at Hayes with newfound curiosity. You never said you were a marshal. Hayes shrugged uncomfortably. U.S. Deputy Marshal out of the Wyoming Territory for 3 years after the war. Hung up the badge last spring after Thomas was killed. When your superiors wouldn't let you go after his killers, Abernathy added. Word gets around, Hayes. Hayes said nothing, but his jaw tightened noticeably. That night, as Abernathy snored softly nearby, Josephine found herself unable to sleep. She sat up, watching the embers of their fire. You should be resting, Hayes said quietly from where he kept watch. I keep seeing that stagecoach driver's face, she admitted. One moment he was alive, the next. She shook her head. I've never seen someone die before. Hayes moved to sit beside her. The first time stays with you. During the war, I thought I'd grow numb to it. Never did. Is that why you became a marshal, to protect people? Partly. Also didn't know what else to do after the war. Seemed like a way to keep some order in a world that had lost its meaning. In the faint glow of the dying fire, his face looked younger, less guarded. Josephine found herself studying the curve of his jaw, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly. You could have left me, continued tracking the Blackburns without the burden of an injured woman. Hayes was quiet for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. My mother used to say that in a world full of cruelty, small acts of kindness matter most, he finally replied. Besides, I couldn't just leave you bleeding in the grass. The simple honesty of his answer touched something in Josephine. Impulsively, she reached out and placed her hand over his. Thank you. Hayes looked startled by the contact but didn't pull away. After a moment, he gently squeezed her hand before standing. Get some sleep, Joe. Tomorrow will be another long day. The morning dawned clear and cool. After saying goodbye to Abernathy, who set off toward Bozeman, Hayes and Josephine continued their journey. Hayes had decided to follow the Blackburn gang to Widow's Creek, reasoning that turning back now would only put them at risk of running into the outlaws again. My leg feels stronger today, Josephine observed as they rode. Indeed, while still painful, she found she could put some weight on it when Hayes helped her down from the horse during their breaks. You heal quick, Hayes commented. Another day or two and you might be able to walk short distances. Then I can ride till I can run again, just like you said. She smiled and was rewarded with a rare grin from Hayes that transformed his serious face. That's the spirit, he said. As they traveled, Hayes taught Josephine more about tracking and survival in the wilderness. She proved an apt student, her natural intelligence and curiosity impressing him. My father would have liked you, she told him as they shared a lunch of rabbit that Hayes had snared. He valued competence and honesty above all else. Hayes looked pleased by the compliment. And what do you value, Joe Kane? She considered the question carefully. Courage, she finally answered. Not the brash kind that men show off in saloons, but the quiet sort that keeps going when things are hard, the kind that faces truth even when it's painful. Hayes studied her thoughtfully. You've got plenty of that yourself. By late afternoon, they approached Widow's Creek, a narrow waterway that cut through a densely forested area at the foot of the Elkhorn Mountains. Hayes grew more cautious, frequently stopping to study the ground for signs of recent passage. "We'll make camp here," he decided as they reached a sheltered hollow about a mile from the creek. "I'll scout ahead on foot, see if I can locate their camp without being spotted." Josephine nodded, though anxiety gnawed at her stomach. "Be careful." Hayes squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before disappearing into the trees. Alone, Josephine busied herself making a small camp, careful not to create too much smoke that might give away their position. Her leg ached from the day's travel, but she found she could hobble around their small clearing by leaning on a sturdy branch Hayes had cut for her. As darkness fell with no sign of Hayes returning, Josephine grew increasingly worried. She kept the fire burning low and Hayes's rifle close at hand. Every sound from the surrounding forest made her tense. It was well past midnight when Hayes finally returned, moving silently into the camp. Josephine had to stifle a cry of alarm before recognizing him. "They're camped about 2 miles upstream," he reported in a hushed voice as he accepted the cup of coffee she offered. "5 men total, the 3 from the stagecoach robbery plus 2 others." "What's your plan?" Josephine asked. Hayes sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not sure there is one. 5 against 1 aren't odds I like, especially with you to think about." "I can help," Josephine insisted. "I may be injured, but I can still shoot." Hayes shook his head. "This isn't your fight, Joe." "They tried to kill me," she reminded him. "And they murdered that driver. It became my fight the moment they pulled those triggers." Hayes studied her determined expression and finally nodded. "All right, but we do this smart, not reckless." They spent the rest of the night formulating a plan. Hayes knew the outlaws would be expecting him to approach from the south, following their trail. Instead, they would circle around and approach from the north, using the element of surprise. "We leave at first light," Hayes decided. "Your leg well enough for a couple miles of riding." Josephine nodded. "I'll manage." In the hushed stillness before dawn, as they prepared to depart, Hayes suddenly turned to Josephine. "If anything happens to me," he said quietly, "ride east until you hit the main trail to Helena. Follow it north, don't stop for anyone." Josephine felt her throat tighten. "Nothing's going to happen to you." Hayes's eyes were serious in the faint pre-dawn light. "Just promise me." "I promise," she whispered, "but you have to promise to be careful too." Instead of answering, Hayes surprised her by gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering briefly against her cheek. The tender gesture spoke volumes more than words could have. They rode in silence as the eastern sky lightened. Hayes led them in a wide arc around the outlaws' suspected location, careful to mask their approach. By mid-morning, they had positioned themselves on a wooded ridge overlooking the creek. Below them, they could see the Blackburn gang's camp, 5 men lounging around a fire, apparently in no hurry to move on. A stack of saddlebags near a fallen log likely contained their ill-gotten gains from various robberies. "That's Luther Blackburn," Hayes whispered, pointing to a tall man with a shock of red hair. "The one cleaning his gun is his brother Ezra, not sure about the others." Josephine studied the men who had tried to kill her. They looked surprisingly ordinary, not the monsters her imagination had painted. That made them all the more terrifying somehow. Hayes outlined his strategy. He would approach from the east while Josephine provided cover from their elevated position. If things went according to plan, he would catch them off guard and force their surrender. "And if things don't go according to plan?" Josephine asked. "Then shoot anyone who isn't me," Hayes replied grimly. Before departing, Hayes surprised her again by leaning forward and pressing a quick, firm kiss to her lips. "For luck," he murmured, then slipped away before she could respond. Josephine touched her fingers to her lips, her heart racing from more than just the danger they faced. She positioned herself behind a fallen tree, Hayes's rifle steady in her hands as she watched him make his way stealthily down the ridge. What happened next unfolded with the chaotic speed of a summer storm. Hayes approached the camp undetected until he was nearly upon them. When he finally announced his presence, rifle raised, the outlaws reacted with varying degrees of surprise. Luther Blackburn was the first to recover, diving for cover while shouting to his men. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. Josephine took careful aim and fired at a man attempting to flank Hayes. Her shot went wide, but it distracted the outlaw long enough for Hayes to adjust his position behind a large boulder. The firefight was intense but brief. Hayes managed to wound 2 of the gang members while a third surrendered quickly. Luther and Ezra Blackburn, however, proved more resilient, pinning Hayes down with concentrated fire. From her vantage point, Josephine could see what Hayes could not. Ezra Blackburn was slowly working his way around to come up behind him. Without hesitation, she took aim and fired, her bullet finding its mark in Ezra's shoulder. The man cried out and stumbled, his gun falling from his grasp. Luther, seeing his brother fall, emerged from cover in a reckless charge toward Hayes's position. It was the opening Hayes needed. His shot caught Luther square in the chest, dropping the outlaw leader mid-stride. The sudden silence that followed seemed deafening. Josephine watched as Hayes carefully approached the fallen leader, kicking his gun away before checking for signs of life. Finding none, he secured the remaining outlaws, using their own belts and ropes to bind them. Only when he was certain the situation was under control did Hayes signal for Josephine to join him. She made her way carefully down the ridge, her injured leg protesting but holding steady. "You saved my life," Hayes said as she approached. "That was a fine shot. For a schoolteacher's daughter." She asked with a small smile. "For anyone," he corrected seriously. Over the next few hours, they gathered the outlaws' stolen goods and prepared to transport their prisoners to the nearest settlement with a jail. Josephine found the strongbox from the stagecoach among their possessions, still sealed with the Helena Bank stamp. "What happens now?" she asked as they prepared to depart, the 3 surviving outlaws securely bound on their horses. Hayes glanced at her. "Now we get these men to justice, return what they've stolen, and see you safely to your aunt in Helena." Something in his tone made her heart sink. And then. Hayes hesitated. "I haven't thought that far ahead." They traveled for 2 days before reaching a small but established town with a sheriff's office. The local lawman was initially suspicious of Hayes's story until Josephine corroborated it, and they presented the recovered stolen goods. "The marshal in Helena will want statements from both of you," the sheriff informed them after locking up the prisoners. "Especially since you witnessed the stagecoach robbery, miss." They were offered rooms at the local hotel, the town's gratitude for bringing in the infamous Blackburn gang. After weeks of sleeping rough, the prospect of a real bed and hot bath was tantalizing. That evening, after cleaning up and changing into clothes provided by the general store owner's wife, Josephine found Hayes waiting for her in the hotel's small dining room. He stood as she approached, his eyes widening slightly. The simple blue dress was nothing fancy, but after seeing her only in travel-stained riding clothes, the transformation seemed to catch him off guard. "You look." He started, then seemed to lose his words. "Clean." Josephine suggested with a smile. "Beautiful," Hayes corrected, pulling out her chair. They shared a meal far better than the trail provisions they'd grown accustomed to. As they ate, Josephine noticed Hayes seemed preoccupied, his responses distracted. "What's troubling you?" she finally asked. Hayes set down his fork and met her gaze directly. "I've been thinking about what happens next. And I completed what I set out to do. Thomas can rest easy now." He paused. "But I'm not sure what purpose I have anymore." Josephine reached across the table to take his hand. "Maybe purpose isn't something you find all at once. Maybe it's something that unfolds day by day in the choices you make and the people you help." Hayes turned her hand over, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "When I found you injured in that field, I was only thinking of getting you to safety. I never expected." "Neither did I," Josephine admitted softly. Your aunt is expecting you in Helena, Hayes continued. You have a life waiting there. A life I never chose, Josephine pointed out. A life arranged out of necessity after my father died. Hayes looked at her questioningly. What are you saying, Joe? I'm saying that perhaps we both need to find new purposes, and perhaps, she took a deep breath, we might find them together. The hope that bloomed in Hayes's eyes gave her courage to continue. These past weeks have shown me what kind of man you are, Hayes Irwin, honorable, brave, kind beneath that gruff exterior. She smiled. The kind of man my father would have respected, the kind of man I've come to care for deeply. Hayes squeezed her hand. I have nothing to offer you, Joe, no home, no profession now that I've hung up my badge. You have yourself, Josephine replied simply. That's all I'm asking for. Later that night, they stood on the hotel's small balcony overlooking the quiet town street. Hayes had been quiet since dinner, processing her words. I need to tell you something, he finally said. After we get to Helena and you're settled with your aunt, I've been offered a position. Josephine felt her heart sink. What kind of position? The territorial governor heard about the capture of the Blackburn gang. He's asked me to consider taking on a marshal's badge again. Hayes turned to face her. It would mean traveling the territory, bringing law to places that have little. I see, Josephine said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. It sounds like important work. It is, Hayes agreed, but I told him I needed to consider one very important factor first. What's that? Hayes gently tilted her face up to his. Whether the woman I've fallen in love with would be willing to build a life that might include more than a little danger and a great deal of travel. Josephine's breath caught. Are you asking me to come with you? I'm asking if you'd consider being my wife, Joe Kane. I know we haven't known each other long, but out here, time measures differently, she finished for him. We've lived more in these weeks than some people do in years. Is that a yes? Hayes asked, his voice hopeful. In answer, Josephine stood on tiptoe and kissed him, pouring all her feelings into the connection between them. Hayes's arms went around her strong and secure as he deepened the kiss. Yes, she whispered against his lips when they finally parted. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in Helena, with Josephine's aunt in attendance. The older woman had been skeptical at first, but seeing the obvious love between them had eventually won her over. Your father would have approved, her aunt had whispered during the small reception. He always said you had the good sense to recognize a worthy heart when you found one. Hayes had accepted the marshal's position, with the understanding that his wife would accompany him on his circuits when possible. The territorial governor, impressed by Josephine's courage during the Blackburn incident, readily agreed to the arrangement. 3 months after their wedding, as spring began to paint the Montana landscape with fresh colors, Josephine stood outside their cabin near Helena. Hayes approached from the barn, leading 2 horses saddled for travel. Ready for another adventure, Mrs. Irwin? He asked, his smile warming her heart as it always did. Josephine took the reins of her mare, a gift from Hayes that she had named Liberty. Her leg had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as a reminder of their first meeting. Always, she replied, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. As they rode side by side toward the distant mountains, Josephine reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had brought them together. From an injured woman who couldn't walk to a marshal's wife who rode confidently beside her husband, it was a journey she could never have imagined. What are you thinking about? Hayes asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Josephine smiled at the man who had saved her life and then captured her heart. I was thinking about something a very wise cowboy once told me when I was at my lowest point. Hayes's eyes crinkled with understanding. Ride till you can run again. Exactly, she replied, urging her horse forward. And now I'm running right beside you. Hayes reached across to take her hand briefly, their horses moving in perfect synchrony. And we've got a lifetime of running ahead of us. Together, they rode toward the horizon, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Montana sky.